There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the simple, unremarkable weight of a body shifting on a couch next to you. You don't recognize them as watersheds at the time. There is no thunderclap, no sudden, cinematic zoom. There is only the subtle recalibration of the world as you know it. A change so granular it's imperceptible until you look back and realize that everything that came after was built upon the foundation of that single, silent instant. For me, that moment smelled faintly of rain-damp cotton and the cedarwood scent of Julian's soap. It was the sound of his breathing, finally evening out into the slow, deep rhythm of sleep, a sound that had become the metronome of my own anxious, unrequited heart. He was asleep on my couch. This, in itself, was not a new development. In the 5 years I had known him, Julian had occupied every surface of my small apartment with the casual, sprawling entitlement of a beloved golden retriever. He'd napped on my armchair, done push-ups on my living room rug, and once, memorably, fallen asleep sitting straight up at my kitchen table, his forehead resting against a cold mug of coffee. But this was different. This wasn't the easy, thoughtless sleep of a friend crashing after a long day. This was a retreat, a surrender. For the past 3 weeks, since the spectacular, messy implosion of his relationship with Sarah, my apartment had become his sanctuary, and my couch, his port in a storm. He would arrive late, his face drawn and shadowed, the usual brilliant light in his eyes dimmed to a pilot light. He wouldn't talk much about it, not really. He would just exist in my space, his presence a heavy, silent testament to his pain, and I would let him. I would make him tea he rarely drank and offer him food he'd only pick at. We would watch old movies, the dialogue a comfortable buffer against the things we weren't saying, until his eyelids grew heavy and his posture would soften, slumping into the worn cushions. Tonight, however, a new threshold had been crossed. He had been quieter than usual, a deep, unsettling stillness about him. When the credits of the movie rolled, he didn't make a move to get up. He just lay there, staring at the blank screen, his profile illuminated by the pale blue light of the television. I had waited, my own body rigid with a familiar, painful awareness of his proximity. The air between us was thick with unspoken grief, and something else, something I couldn't yet name. Finally, his voice, when it came, was so quiet it was almost a part of the silence itself. "Leo," he'd murmured, not looking at me. Can I just stay here? In here with you?" He hadn't meant the couch. His gaze had flickered towards the open door of my bedroom, a space that had always been a tacitly understood boundary. It was my space, the one place I could retreat to and reassemble the fractured pieces of my composure after he would inevitably leave. His request was a small earthquake, a tremor that threatened the carefully constructed geography of our friendship. I hadn't known how to answer, so I had simply nodded, a gesture he probably didn't even see in the dim light. A few minutes later, he had unfolded himself from the couch and disappeared into the spare room, leaving me alone with the thunder of my own pulse. But he hadn't closed the door. He'd left it ajar, a silent invitation or perhaps just an oversight, and that single, thoughtless gap had felt like the most terrifying and hopeful thing I had ever seen. Now, hours later, I was still sitting there, listening to the sound of him breathing from a room away, understanding with a slow, dawning horror that the tectonic plates of my life had just shifted, and I had no idea where the ground would settle. To understand the gravity of that open door, you have to understand Julian. We met in college, in a ridiculously oversized lecture hall for a mandatory statistics class that neither of us wanted to be in. I was the quiet kid in the back corner, the one who sketched buildings and faces in the margins of his notebook, content to be an observer. He was the one in the third row who knew everyone, the captain of the swim team, a supernova of easy charm and thoughtless grace. He moved through the world as if it were water, with a fluid confidence that I could only ever dream of. I was drawn to his light, like everyone else, but I kept my distance, cataloging his smiles and the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed as if they were rare artifacts I was only allowed to study from afar. Our friendship began by accident. He'd forgotten his textbook one day, and, scanning the room with a look of theatrical panic, his eyes had landed on me. I had slid my book across the aisle without a word. From that small, mundane exchange, a world bloomed. He had thanked me after class, learned my name, and then, to my utter astonishment, remembered it the next time he saw me. Julian had a unique talent for collecting people, but with me, it felt different. He didn't just collect me. He seemed to genuinely see me. While others saw my quietness as aloofness or disinterest, he seemed to understand it as a language. He learned to read my silences, to interpret the subtle shift in my posture or the slight narrowing of my eyes. He was the only person who ever seemed to notice when I was building walls, and instead of trying to tear them down, he would just sit quietly on the other side and wait for me to open the gate. He'd drag me out of my shell, not with pressure, but with a gentle, persistent gravity. He'd pull me along to parties where I would stand awkwardly in a corner, and he would always find his way back to me, a drink in hand, leaning against the wall beside me, creating a small, two-person island in the middle of a roaring sea of people. "You good?" he'd ask, his voice a low rumble against the music. And I always was, as long as he was there. My feelings for him were a slow, creeping vine, something that grew so gradually I didn't notice it was wrapping itself around my heart until it was too late to cut it back. It wasn't a single moment of realization, but 1,000 tiny ones. It was the time he fell asleep on my shoulder during a late-night study session, his head a warm, trusting weight, and the air had left my lungs in a silent gasp. It was the way he'd look for my face in a crowd after a successful swim meet. His triumphant grin meant just for me. It was watching him with his girlfriends, a string of bright, beautiful women who all seemed to adore him, and feeling a strange, hollow ache in my chest that I mistook for envy before I understood it was yearning. His relationship with Sarah had been the most serious. They had been together for 2 years, and she was lovely. She was smart and funny, and she understood his light, but I always felt she didn't quite understand his shadows. She saw the confident swimmer, the charming friend, the ambitious software engineer. I wasn't sure she saw the boy who sometimes got lost in his own head, the one whose bright energy was sometimes a frantic defense against a deep-seated loneliness he never spoke of. I saw it, though. I saw it in the moments he would fall silent in the middle of a sentence, his eyes going distant, or in the way he would sometimes just show up at my door with no explanation, needing the quiet comfort of my presence to recalibrate himself. I had built a fortress around my feelings, a masterpiece of emotional architecture designed for one purpose: to protect our friendship. It was the most precious thing I had, this strange, symbiotic bond with a person who felt like my other half. The thought of shattering it with the clumsy weight of my own inconvenient heart was unbearable. So I became an expert in sublimation. My love for him was poured into my photography, into the countless candid shots I had of him where I tried to capture not just his smile, but the fleeting melancholy behind it. It was channeled into the way I cared for him, anticipating his needs, knowing when he needed to talk and when he needed silence, being the stable, predictable harbor he could always return to. I was his best friend. It was a role I cherished and a cage I had built for myself. I had accepted the terms of my own confinement. I would love him from a distance, silently, for the rest of my life if I had to. It was a painful peace, but it was peace nonetheless. And then Sarah had left him, and in the rubble of that relationship, Julian had reached for me, not as a friend, but as a lifeline, and he had no idea that in doing so, he was threatening to demolish the very fortress I had built to keep him safe from me. The breakup was brutal. It wasn't a quiet drifting apart, it was a detonation. Julian, who usually processed his emotions internally, was unmoored. He showed up at my apartment the night it happened, looking like a ship that had been dashed against the rocks. His clothes were rumpled, his hair was a mess, and his eyes, usually so full of life, were just empty. He'd stumbled in and collapsed onto my couch, and for the first hour, he just stared at the ceiling, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. I didn't press him. I just sat in the armchair across from him, a silent sentinel, letting my presence be a form of pressure, a quiet resistance against the vacuum of his despair. Eventually, the story came out in broken fragments, a litany of miscommunications, of expectations not met, of two people who loved each other but had forgotten how to speak the same language. She said I wasn't there, he'd whispered, his voice raw, even when I was sitting right next to her. She said it was like talking to a ghost. That was the part that struck me, because I knew exactly what she meant. I had seen that ghost. I knew the way Julian could retreat so far into himself that his physical body seemed like a mere shell he'd left behind. It was a defense mechanism, a way of weathering storms by becoming intangible. But what Sarah saw as a void, I had always seen as a depth. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was a space filled with thoughts too heavy or too tangled to be spoken. I had learned to sit in that space with him without needing him to fill it. In the weeks that followed, he began to seek out that silent space more and more. He started leaving things at my apartment: a toothbrush, a change of clothes, his favorite hoodie. They were small, almost insignificant objects, but they felt like anchors, tethering him to my shore. Our evenings fell into a new, fragile routine. He would come over after work, shed the skin of his day at my door, and we would coexist. Sometimes we'd talk, but mostly we wouldn't. We would just be. I'd work on editing photos, the soft click of my mouse a steady rhythm in the room, while he'd lie on the couch, sometimes scrolling on his phone, but often just staring into space. The first time he asked to stay, it was under a perfectly plausible pretext. A storm had rolled in, a violent summer squall that turned the streets into rivers. "No way I'm driving in that," he'd said, gesturing to the window where lightning was splitting the sky. "You mind if I take the couch?" Of course, I didn't mind. I had retrieved the spare blankets and a pillow, my hands feeling clumsy and overly large. I had tried to keep my movements casual, to act as if this was the most normal thing in the world, while inside, my entire nervous system was screaming. Having him in my apartment was one thing. Having him sleep here, under my roof, breathing the same recycled air through the night, it was a new level of proximity that felt both intoxicating and terrifyingly dangerous. I had retreated to my bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it for a long moment, trying to slow my breathing. I could hear him moving around, the creak of the couch springs, the soft rustle of blankets. It was the most intimate sound I had ever heard. This became the ritual. It was never planned. It would just happen. There was always a reason, at first. He'd worked too late. He was too tired to drive home. He'd had a couple of beers and didn't want to risk it. Each excuse was a thin veil over the truth we both seemed to understand but refused to acknowledge. He just didn't want to be alone in his own apartment, a space that was now haunted by the ghost of his past relationship. I never questioned his reasons. I simply accepted them, playing my part in our unspoken agreement. I would set him up on the couch, bid him a quiet good night, and then retreat to my room, where I would lie awake for hours, hyper-aware of his presence just one wall away. I was an astronomer charting the movements of a nearby star, cataloging the soft sighs, the mumbles in his sleep, the way the floorboards would groan when he got up in the middle of the night for a glass of water. My small apartment, once my sanctuary, had been transformed into a shared territory, and its emotional geography was becoming more complex with each passing night. The living room was his, the bedroom was mine, and the hallway between them was a no-man's land fraught with a strange, humming tension. I was living on a knife's edge, caught between the profound comfort of having him near and the exquisite agony of knowing it was all built on a foundation of his pain and my silence. The transition from the couch to my bedroom happened so subtly that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. It was a few weeks into our new arrangement. The excuses for him staying over had long since evaporated. He just stayed. It was the new normal. One night, I was already in bed, reading, when he appeared in the doorway. He didn't knock. He never did. He just leaned against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked exhausted. The skin under his eyes was bruised with fatigue. "My back is killing me," he said, his voice a low murmur. "That couch is starting to feel like a medieval torture device." I looked at him, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I knew what was coming next, and a part of me, The logical, self-preservationist part screamed at me to shut it down, to make a joke, to offer him an extra pillow. But the other part of me, the foolish, hopeful part that I had tried so hard to starve, was listening with rapt attention. "It's just," he continued, pushing off the doorframe and taking a hesitant step into the room. "Your bed is huge. And you're like a statue when you sleep." He offered a weak, tired smile. "I'd stay on my side. I promise." It was a question wrapped in a statement, a request disguised as an observation. Every instinct I had honed over 5 years of loving him silently was now on high alert. This was dangerous. This was a line, a significant, brightly painted line, and he was asking to step over it. But looking at his face, at the genuine weariness etched into his features and the quiet plea in his eyes, I found I was incapable of refusing him. The desire to offer him comfort, to ease his pain in any small way, overrode everything else. It was my fatal flaw where he was concerned. I would have set myself on fire if I thought it would keep him warm. So I just shrugged, a gesture I hoped looked casual. "Sure," I said, my voice sounding impossibly distant. "It's fine." He had nodded, a quick, grateful dip of his head, and disappeared for a moment, returning with his pillow from the couch. The ritual of preparing for bed, something I always did alone, was suddenly a shared activity. I watched him move around the small space, the quiet economy of his movements. I turned off my bedside lamp, plunging the room into a soft darkness, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the window. I lay down, my back to the center of the bed, creating as much space as I possibly could. I heard the dip of the mattress as he got in, felt the subtle shift of the whole structure as he settled. And then there was only silence. A profound, charged, and utterly terrifying silence. He was less than 2 feet away from me. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small gulf of cotton sheets. I could hear his breathing, not as a distant sound from another room, but as a presence right beside me. I lay there, perfectly still, my muscles clenched, my entire being focused on the space between us. It felt like a vast, empty canyon and a single, taut wire all at the same time. I did not sleep that night. I simply lay awake, a sentinel guarding a border that had just been irrevocably breached. That first night set the precedent for a new, even more precarious ritual. The couch was forgotten. My bed was now our shared space. The pretense of his bad back was mentioned once more, and then never again. He would simply end the night by walking into my room and getting into the bed. We never talked about it. It was another unspoken agreement in a friendship that was becoming increasingly defined by them. We were like 2 planets caught in a strange, dual orbit, circling a common center of gravity that neither of us dared to name. The first week was an exercise in mutual, rigid self-control. We would lie on our respective edges of the queen-sized mattress, a chasm of empty space between us, our backs to each other. It was a careful, choreographed dance of avoidance. If one of us had to get up in the night, we would do so with the stealth of a cat burglar, trying not to disturb the fragile peace. But proximity has its own physics. It wears down defenses. The space between us began to shrink, incrementally, night by night. It started with an accident, a night when he, in his sleep, had rolled over, and his hand had brushed against my back. I had frozen, my entire body going rigid. I expected him to pull away instantly, even in sleep, as if he'd touched a hot stove. But he didn't. His hand just rested there, a warm, heavy presence against my shirt. My mind went into overdrive, a frantic cascade of thoughts. Was he awake? Did he mean to do it? Was this a signal, or just the thoughtless movement of a sleeping body? I lay there for what felt like an eternity, barely breathing, until his fingers twitched and he rolled away again, leaving the spot on my back tingling with a phantom heat. After that, the accidental touches became more frequent, a foot brushing against mine, his knee pressing into the back of my thigh. Each touch was a small spark in the darkness, igniting a fresh wave of hope and anxiety within me. I became a scholar of his sleep patterns, of the way he would sigh just before drifting off, the way he would sometimes murmur incomprehensible things, his voice thick and soft. I was living in a state of heightened sensory awareness. I knew the exact scent of his shampoo, the texture of the worn cotton of his t-shirts, the precise rhythm of his heartbeat when he slept so deeply it seemed to resonate through the mattress itself. My world had shrunk to the confines of that bed, to the charged space he occupied within it. It was a sweet, unbearable torture. I was closer to him than I had ever been, and yet we had never been further apart. We were sharing a bed, but we weren't sharing a truth, and the silence that filled the space between us was becoming heavier than any words could ever be. The change, when it came, was not a slow erosion but a sudden shift, a surrender. It was a cold night, the kind where the chill seems to seep in through the window panes. He had gotten into bed and, as usual, turned his back to me. We lay in our familiar silence for a long time. I was on the verge of drifting off, my body finally succumbing to exhaustion, when I felt him move. He didn't just roll over. He shifted with purpose, moving across the mattress until his chest was pressed against my back. An arm, warm and heavy, came to rest around my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us at all. My breath caught in my throat. My heart felt like it was going to hammer its way out of my chest. This was not an accident. This was not the unconscious movement of sleep. He was awake. I knew he was. I could feel the deliberate, steady rise and fall of his chest against my shoulder blades. He tucked his face into the space between my neck and my shoulder, and I felt his warm breath against my skin. Cold, he mumbled, his voice a low, drowsy vibration that traveled through my entire body. It was an excuse, the flimsiest of them all, but it was the one he offered, and I clung to it like a lifeline. It was the permission I needed to not panic, to not pull away, to not shatter this fragile, impossible moment. I just lay there, rigid at first, every muscle in my body screaming with a mixture of terror and elation. And then, slowly, I forced myself to relax. I let my body soften against his. I let myself feel the solid, comforting weight of him, the secure circle of his arm around me. He sighed, a soft sound of contentment, and snuggled closer. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the familiar, slow rhythm of sleep. But I remained awake, suspended in a state of disbelief and wonder. He was holding me. He had sought me out, not for conversation, not for distraction, but for warmth, for comfort, for simple, physical closeness. The walls of my carefully constructed fortress were crumbling to dust, and for the first time, I didn't care. I just wanted to stay in the ruins with him. From that night on, the ritual was transformed. The pretense of separate spaces was gone. He would get into bed and, without hesitation, wrap himself around me. It became our new language. His arm around my waist was an apology for his sadness. My stillness as I let him hold me was my way of saying, "I'm here." It was a conversation held in the dark, without a single word. My nights were now spent in a state of suspended animation, caught between the deep, grounding comfort of his embrace and the sharp, painful awareness of my own feelings. I was his human teddy bear, his living security blanket, and I was so pathetically grateful for the role that I was willing to endure the exquisite pain of it. To have the one thing you have always wanted, but in a form you cannot truly claim, is a unique kind of hell. I loved the weight of him, the scent of him, the feeling of his heart beating against my back. But I was also acutely aware of the context. This was not born of romance. It was born of his grief. I was a port in a storm, and I knew, with a certainty that hollowed me out, that when the storm passed, he would set sail again, and I would be left on the shore. Yet, there were moments, small, fleeting glimpses of something more, that I would hoard like a dragon hoarding gold. Sometimes, in the morning, I would wake up before him and find our limbs tangled together, his face peaceful in sleep, his features softened. In those quiet, pre-dawn moments, I would allow myself to pretend. I would let myself believe that this was real, that we were not just two friends clinging to each other for comfort, but two people who had found a home in one another. I would study the curve of his eyelashes against his cheek, the way a lock of his dark hair fell across his forehead. I would commit these images to memory, developing them in the darkroom of my mind, knowing they would be all I had to sustain me when this was all over. Then his eyes would flutter open, and for a split second, before full consciousness took hold, his gaze would be soft, unguarded. He would smile a small, sleepy smile, and my heart would ache with the beauty and the tragedy of it all. Then he would remember, and a flicker of something, confusion or maybe guilt, would cross his face, and he would gently untangle himself from me, putting the space back between us as the daylight world reasserted its rules. We were living a strange, bifurcated life. By day, we were Leo and Julian, best friends. We'd make coffee, talk about work, go for runs. Everything was normal, easy, platonic. But by night, we would enter a different world, a silent, dark space where boundaries blurred and bodies communicated a language of need and comfort that our waking minds refused to acknowledge. I was an expert at navigating this duality, at packing away my nighttime heart when the sun came up. I had to be, but I could see it was taking a toll on him. He was quieter, more withdrawn. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with a strange, searching expression that I couldn't decipher. The unspoken thing between us was growing, filling all the available space until the silence in the room was louder than any conversation. I knew we were approaching a precipice. The careful architecture of our arrangement was becoming unstable. Something had to give. I just prayed that when it did, we wouldn't both be buried in the collapse. The breaking point arrived on a quiet Thursday night. There was nothing remarkable about the day that preceded it. It was a day like any other, filled with the comfortable rhythms of our strange cohabitation. But as evening fell, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable tension. We ate dinner in near silence, the clinking of our forks against the plates sounding like gunshots in the quiet. Julian seemed a million miles away, his gaze fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. After dinner, we didn't turn on the television. We just sat in the living room, surrounded by the encroaching shadows, the silence stretching taut between us. I could feel a storm brewing, not outside, but inside the four walls of my apartment, inside him. I waited, my own anxiety a low thrum beneath my skin. Finally, he spoke. "I saw Sarah today," he said, his voice flat. My stomach clenched. I had been waiting for this, dreading it. I knew that his healing would eventually lead him back to some form of contact with her, to closure. I also knew that closure for him would likely mean the end of this fragile, nighttime world we had built. "Oh," I said, my own voice carefully neutral. "How was that?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was deeply agitated. "It was fine. Civil, we got coffee. Talked." He looked up at me then, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, raw confusion. She asked if I was seeing anyone. I didn't know what to say. The question hung in the air between us. It was a simple question, but it was a crowbar prying at the foundations of our unspoken arrangement. What were we? What was this thing we were doing? We were friends who slept in the same bed and held each other through the night. We were two people sharing an intimacy that surpassed any label we could put on it, and yet we had no label at all. I didn't know what to say either. I just looked at him, my own heart a tangled knot of fear and hope. He stood up and began to pace the small living room, his movements restless, caged. "This is so messed up, Leo," he said, more to himself than to me. "What are we doing?" He stopped in front of me, looking down at me, his face a mask of conflict. "I can't. I shouldn't be using you like this. You're my best friend. It's not fair to you." The words were like a punch to the gut. Using me. He saw this as a transaction, an act of selfish comfort-seeking. He didn't see the years of silent devotion I had offered him. He didn't see that this wasn't a burden to me, but a precious, painful gift. But he also didn't see the whole truth. He didn't see how much I wanted, how much I yearned for this to be more than just a temporary solace. His guilt was a wall between us, a wall built of his own assumptions about me, about my own needs and feelings. I knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that if I didn't say something, if I didn't tear down that wall, I would lose him. The fragile world we had built would shatter, and our friendship might shatter with it. Later that night, the tension followed us to bed. It was a living thing in the room, a third presence on the mattress. For the first time in weeks, he lay on his side of the bed, his back to me, a rigid line of rejection. The space between us was back, colder and wider than ever before. The silence was not comfortable or sleepy. It was a weapon. It was filled with his guilt and my fear. I lay there, my eyes wide open in the dark, my heart aching with a grief that felt premature. This was it. This was the end. He was going to pull away, create distance to assuage his guilt, and we would go back to being just friends. Only now our friendship would be haunted by the ghost of this intimacy. The thought was unbearable. I couldn't go back to the way things were, not after this. I would rather risk everything, the friendship, the comfort, all of it, for one moment of honesty, than suffocate in this silence for one more night. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, a war being waged between my ingrained habit of self-protection and a desperate, rising need to fight for this. For him. For us. The fear of his rejection was a cold, physical thing in my chest, but the fear of losing him to this misunderstanding was even greater. Finally, I took a breath, a deep, shuddering inhale that felt like plunging into icy water. I reached across the chasm between us and gently touched his shoulder. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. "Julian," I whispered, my voice barely a sound in the darkness. He didn't answer, but I knew he was awake. I could feel the tension in his body. "Don't," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Please don't pull away from me." He was silent for a long moment, and then he let out a long, shaky breath. "I'm sorry, Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. For all of this, sorry for what?" I asked, my voice gaining a bit of strength. "For needing someone? There's nothing to be sorry for, it's not that," he said, and he finally turned over, rolling onto his back to stare at the ceiling. I could just make out his profile in the faint moonlight. It's not just about needing someone. It's about needing you. And I don't know what that means. I don't know why. My head is so messed up. His confession hung in the air, a fragile, beautiful, terrifying thing. He needed me. Not just a warm body, not just a friend, but me. The hope that I had tried so hard to kill surged through me, fierce and overwhelming. I shifted, turning onto my side to face him. He didn't look at me, but I could feel his awareness of my movement. The air was electric. This was the precipice. "Julian," I said again, my voice soft but firm. "Look at me," slowly, hesitantly. He turned his head, and his eyes met mine in the dim light. They were shining with unshed tears, filled with a storm of confusion and fear and something else, something I had only ever dreamed of seeing there. It was a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "What if?" I started, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "What if you're not using me? What if this is just where we are now?" He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. And then, his voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the darkness. He asked the question that changed everything. "Leo," he whispered. I waited. "Can I ask you something stupid?" My own voice was a hoarse whisper. Always, he took a breath, and the world seemed to stop spinning on its axis. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" Time seemed to fracture in that moment. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one filled with the thunder of my own blood in my ears. His question was not a proposition, it was a plea. It was a confession of a feeling he didn't understand, a desperate reach across the chasm of his own confusion. It was the most terrifying and beautiful question I had ever heard. In my mind, 1,000 different scenarios played out. I could say no, protect us both, retreat to the safety of our friendship, and spend the rest of my life wondering. I could make a joke, deflect, pretend he didn't just strip himself bare for me. Or I could meet him there, on that terrifying, unstable ground, and risk everything. There was no real choice. I had been walking towards this moment for 5 years. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't have spoken if I'd tried. Instead, I moved, closing the small distance that remained between us. I lifted a hand, my fingers trembling slightly, and cupped his cheek. His skin was warm, and he leaned into my touch, his eyes fluttering shut. It was all the answer he needed. He met me halfway, his lips finding mine in the darkness. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was tentative, soft, a question in itself. It was filled with all the uncertainty and yearning that had been humming between us for weeks. It tasted of salt and sorrow and a fragile, burgeoning hope. It was a kiss that felt like coming home after a long, lonely journey. We stayed like that for a long moment. Just a soft pressure of lips, a shared breath. It was enough. When we finally pulled apart, we didn't speak. He just moved closer, his forehead resting against mine. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine, a firm, grounding grip. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the silence between us was not heavy or fraught with unspoken things. It was peaceful. It was a quiet, shared space of understanding. He had crossed the line, and I had met him there, and in the space between one breath and the next, everything had changed. The morning after was a landscape of quiet terror. I woke first, as I always did, to the soft gray light of dawn filtering into the room. Julian was still asleep, his arm thrown over my waist, his face buried in the pillow next to mine. For a moment, a beautiful, idyllic moment, I forgot the monumental shift of the night before. It was just another morning in our strange domesticity. Then the memory of the kiss returned, and with it, a cold wave of anxiety. What now? What did this mean? I lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him, not wanting to face the inevitable conversation that lay ahead of us. I was terrified that in the harsh light of day, he would retreat, that he would dismiss the kiss as a moment of grief-fueled confusion. When he finally stirred, it was with a soft groan. He stretched, and his eyes opened, finding mine almost immediately. The unguarded, sleepy softness was there for a split second, and then it was gone, replaced by a look of dawning horror. He remembered. He pulled his arm back as if he'd been burned, and sat up, scrubbing a hand over his face. He wouldn't look at me. He started, then stopped. He swallowed hard. I should go, the words were a physical blow. He was running. He was retreating back to his side of the line, leaving me stranded. He scrambled out of bed, pulling on the clothes he'd discarded on the floor the night before with frantic, clumsy movements. "Julian," I said, my voice quiet, but he just shook his head, still not looking at me. "I can't, Leo. Not right now." And then he was gone. I heard the front door open and close, and then there was only silence, a silence that was 1,000 times more profound and empty than any that had come before. I was alone in my bed, in the wreckage of what we had built, the ghost of his kiss still on my lips. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. The silence from Julian was absolute. He didn't answer my texts. He didn't pick up my calls. My apartment, which had been a shared sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Every surface held a memory of him. His hoodie was still slung over the back of the armchair. His toothbrush was still in the cup next to mine. They were relics of a life that had existed only a few days ago, but now felt like it belonged to another century. My own mind was a torture chamber. I replayed the kiss, the conversation, every moment of the past few weeks, over and over again, searching for the point where I had gone wrong. Had I pushed him? Had I misinterpreted his need for comfort as something more? The self-doubt was a corrosive acid, eating away at the fragile hope that had bloomed in the dark. I had allowed myself to believe, just for a moment, and now I was paying the price. The fortress I had so carefully maintained was gone, and I was left exposed and shivering in the ruins. After 3 days of this agonizing silence, something inside me broke. It was a quiet, clean snap. I was done waiting. I was done being the passive observer of my own life. I had risked everything by meeting him in that kiss, and I would not let him erase it with his fear and confusion. He didn't have the right to leave me in this limbo, to make me question my own reality. I deserved an answer, even if it was the one I didn't want to hear. I grabbed my keys, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and terror, and walked out of my apartment. I drove to his place, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had no idea what I was going to say, but I knew I had to see him. I had to look him in the eye and force him to acknowledge what had happened between us. When he opened the door, he looked even worse than I felt. He was pale, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He saw me, and his face crumpled. He tried to close the door, but I put my hand out to stop him. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected it to be. You don't get to do this. You don't get to run away. I pushed my way inside, and he stumbled back. His apartment was a mess, clothes strewn everywhere, takeout containers piled on the coffee table. It was the physical manifestation of his internal chaos. He wouldn't look at me. He just stood in the middle of the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "What do you want me to say, Leo?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "I want you to tell me the truth," I said, my own voice trembling now. "I want you to look at me and tell me what that kiss was. Was it a mistake? Was it just about Sarah? Was I just a convenient body in your bed? Because if that's what it was, you need to say it. You need to say it to my face." The words poured out of me, a torrent of all the pain and fear I had been holding in. He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with so much anguish that it stole my breath. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "God, no. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't about Sarah. It was about you." He took a shaky step towards me. "Leo, you have to understand. You're my best friend. You're the most important person in my life. And I think I'm in love with you. And it scares the hell out of me." His confession, so raw and unplanned, hung in the air between us. He loved me. He had said the words I had only ever allowed myself to dream of in the deepest, most secret parts of my heart. But they were tangled up in his fear, his confusion. He looked terrified, as if he had just admitted to a crime. "I don't know who I am anymore," he continued, his voice breaking. "Everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, it's all just gone. When I'm with you, everything is quiet. Everything makes sense. And then you're not there, and I'm just lost. Kissing you felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. And that's what's so terrifying." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I don't want to ruin what we have. I would rather die than lose you as my friend." And in that moment, all my anger, all my fear, just evaporated. It was replaced by a wave of profound, aching tenderness. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was terrified of this new, uncharted territory, and in his fear, he had hurt me, but it hadn't been his intention. He was just a man adrift, trying to find his bearings. I closed the distance between us and wrapped my arms around him. He was stiff at first, surprised, and then he just melted against me, burying his face in my shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. I held him, my own tears silently tracking down my face. I held him and let him break, let him fall apart in my arms, offering him the same silent, steady comfort I always had. But this time, it was different. This time, we were both on the same side of the wall. There were no more secrets, no more unspoken things. There was only the raw, messy, terrifying, and beautiful truth. We stood like that for a long time, in the middle of his messy living room, just holding on to each other. It wasn't a solution. It didn't magically fix his confusion or erase my hurt. But it was a start. It was an anchor in the storm. When his sobs finally subsided, he pulled back, his face tear-streaked but clearer than it had been in days. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. "For being a coward." I shook my head, wiping a tear from his cheek with my thumb. "We're both scared," I said. "This is new. For both of us. But we don't have to figure it all out right now. We just have to stop running." He nodded, a small, shaky movement. He looked around his apartment, at the chaos that mirrored his own mind. "I don't want to be here," he said quietly. Can we go back to your place?" The walk back to my apartment was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the tense, brittle silence of the past few days. It was a soft, gentle silence, a space for us to just breathe. When we got inside, the first thing he did was walk over to the armchair and pick up his hoodie. He held it for a moment, then looked at me. "I want to start over," he said. "Not our friendship. This, whatever this is. Can we just take it slow? Be honest." I nodded, my heart feeling so full it might burst. "I'd like that," I said. That night, we ordered pizza and watched a stupid movie, just like we used to. But everything was different. He sat closer to me on the couch, his thigh pressed against mine. He would look at me, really look at me, and smile a small, real smile. The ghost was gone. He was present. He was here, with me. When it was time for bed, a new, gentle kind of awkwardness settled over us. We stood in the hallway, by the open door to my bedroom, the space that had once been a symbol of our unspoken boundaries, and then our secret intimacy was now a question mark. He looked at the bed, then at me. "Can I still?" he started, his voice hesitant. "Of course," I said softly. We got into bed, and for a moment, we lay on our separate sides, the old habit dying hard. Then, he rolled over to face me. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and took my hand, his thumb stroking over my knuckles. It was a simple gesture, but it was filled with intention. It wasn't a desperate grab for comfort. It was a choice. He was choosing to be here, to be with me. I laced my fingers with his, and we just lay there, face to face in the quiet darkness, holding hands. It was more intimate than any kiss. It was a promise. And for the first time, when I fell asleep, it was not with a heart full of anxiety, but with a profound, quiet sense of peace. I was home. The days and weeks that followed were a process of learning a new language together. We were mapping a new country, a territory that existed somewhere between the friendship we had known and the future we were cautiously, tentatively building. There were no grand romantic gestures. Our love story was written in the quiet margins of everyday life. It was in the way he started making the coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it. It was in the way I would find myself unconsciously reaching for his hand when we walked down the street, and the way he would always, without hesitation, lace his fingers with mine. It was in the conversations we finally started to have, the real ones. He talked about his fears, about the difficult process of unraveling the identity he had built for himself. I talked about the years of silent yearning, about the fortress I had built around my heart. We laid our vulnerabilities bare, and in that shared honesty, we found a new, stronger foundation. The physical intimacy between us evolved slowly, naturally. It was a gentle exploration, a conversation told through touch. There were more kisses, soft and searching at first, then growing in confidence and warmth. They were no longer desperate questions in the dark, but affirmations. They were, "I see you," and "I'm here," and "I'm not going anywhere." We learned the landscape of each other's bodies not with haste, but with a quiet reverence. We learned that his embrace was not just a source of comfort for him, but for me too. We learned that the simple act of falling asleep and waking up next to someone, day after day, was a profound act of love in itself. The door to my bedroom, which had once been a symbol of a boundary left carelessly ajar, was now closed every night. Not to shut the world out, but to keep our world in. It was our space, a sanctuary we had built together, brick by brick, out of honesty and patience. There was a moment, about a month into our new beginning, that I knew, with absolute certainty, that we were going to be okay. I had been working late in my home office, editing a set of photos. He had been quiet all evening, curled up on the couch, reading. Around midnight, he came into my office and just stood in the doorway, watching me. I looked up and smiled. "Hey," I said. "You should get some sleep." He didn't answer. He just walked over to me, wrapped his arms around my shoulders from behind, and rested his chin on the top of my head. I leaned back against his chest, my hands coming up to cover his where they were clasped in front of me. We stayed like that for a long time, just breathing together, the only sound the soft hum of my computer. "What are you thinking about?" I finally asked. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, his voice a low, soft rumble against my hair, "I was just thinking. I spent so long feeling like a ghost. And I think it's because I was haunting the wrong house." He tightened his embrace. "This feels like home, and in the end, that's what it all came down to. Home. It isn't a place, or a building with four walls and a roof. It's a feeling. It's the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you are seen, truly seen, in all your messy, complicated, beautiful glory. It's the safety of a shared silence, the comfort of a familiar presence. For years, I had made a home for Julian in my friendship, a safe harbor where he could be his truest self without judgment. And in his darkest moment, he had stumbled into that home and, without realizing it, had decided to stay. He just needed to find the courage to unpack his bags. We had found our way to each other through a storm, navigating by the dim, uncertain light of our own confused hearts. But we had made it to the shore. And now, in the quiet aftermath, we began to build our life, not on the shifting sands of need and grief, but on the solid ground of a love that had been there all along, just waiting patiently to be named. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together.